Money doesn't disappear. Whenever one part of the economy is running a deficit, some other part is running a surplus. Hi, I'm Richard Vague with Tycos. Today we're going to look at the 5 macro sectors of the economy: households, businesses, the financial sector, government, and the rest of the world, and follow how money circulates through the economy without ever disappearing. Let's start by showing you a chart we've shown you a few times before. This is based on the data from the Federal Reserve showing income and expense by sector from 1950 forward. It's all expressed as a percent of GDP. In this particular chart, we show you only 2 of the 5 macro sectors, the household sector and the government sector. When you look at any transaction in the economy, what shows up as an expense for one party is income for someone else. If you buy a $50,000 car from a dealer, that $50,000 is your spending, and at that same moment, it is $50,000 of income to the dealer. Every transaction looks like that. One side's expense is the other side's income. Income equals expense, which means the whole thing is balanced and symmetrical and, frankly, nets out to zero. This is true even if you took out a loan to buy the car. This is the most straightforward, realistic, and, in our view, useful way to show income and expense in an economy. What is striking and obvious when you look at these two, the government and households, is that they largely mirror each other. The greater the deficit or net expense of the government, the greater the net income of households. This is a hugely important fact. When the government spends money, it does not disappear. It largely goes straight into the checking accounts of households. Now that you see that, I want to point out a few interesting tidbits here. Remember when President Clinton balanced the budget in the year 2000? Remember that people were talking about how government debt might disappear altogether? Well, notice that household income reached an all-time low in that year. Also, remember when home sales were skyrocketing in 2005 and thereabouts, just before the global financial crisis? Well, keeping in mind that these purchases are recorded as an expense to households, even when the buyer takes out a mortgage, you will notice that household income went negative at that point. 2005, or perhaps someone should have noticed that and taken it as a warning. And finally, look at both 2009 and 2020, when the government enacted massive stimulus programs to bail out the economy from the global financial crisis and the global pandemic, respectively. You could see very clearly that, in both cases, much of that money quickly went to households. By the way, you and I would label these lines the net income of households and the net expense or deficit of government. But economists often refer to them confusingly as net borrowing and net lending. You may come across this if you dig into this. More on that some other day. But the economy is not solely made up of households and the government. So let's look now at the 3 other macro sectors of the economy: non-financial businesses, financial businesses, and the rest of the world. First, non-financial businesses. You'll notice 2 things immediately. First, in this span from 1950 forward, business net income is zero-ish and actually slightly negative most of the time. Second, business net income has been a little bit better in the last, let's say, 20 years or so. So why would business net income be negative most of the time? Simple, because the very purpose of a business is to funnel its income to its owners, who are households, primarily wealthy households. This happens primarily through dividends to shareholders or distributions to partners and other similar means. And remember that this P&L is an expense, is after all cash transactions. So these distributions and dividends actually are a deduction from income. So, but why has business net income been somewhat better lately? Well, we will get into that more next week, but for now, suffice to say that this improvement has come at the very same time that government deficits have increased markedly. Again, the government money does not disappear when it is spent. It goes to households and, to a somewhat lesser extent, to businesses. Have you ever stopped to think that the second biggest beneficiary of welfare-type programs, after the recipients of that welfare, the people themselves, are the businesses that serve these low-income constituency? So that's a bit of what we're seeing here. When welfare largesse increases, there is a distinct sector within the business community that benefits. Okay, that's the business sector. We've got two sectors left. First, the financial sector. Here we show it by itself, just so you can see it clearly. The financial sector, banks, funds, investment companies, and the like, is viewed as an intermediary function, and we see that clearly here as its net income hovers close to zero, as it also exists to provide income to its owners, which again are largely wealthy households, and again that happens largely through dividends and distributions. So that's the financial business sector. Now we're going to show non-financial businesses, financial businesses, and the government deficit all together at the same time. And you can see that non-financial businesses and financial businesses received a boost from government stimulus, especially in the Obama stimulus of 2009. Now, if we take the next step and add in households and total it up, we can see that in total, these four domestic macro sectors, households, government, non-financial businesses, and financial businesses, have negative income, which, realistically means the U.S. as a whole has negative income. Now, I've said that income equals expense, but we can see here that is clearly not the case, since the U.S. in total has negative income. What is the missing piece? The answer to that very important question is our fifth and last macro sector, the rest of the world. This is obviously not a single entity, but instead the sum of all the foreign businesses and households that we do business with, or with any entity in the U.S. does business with. The U.S. has a net trade deficit. That's the expression of this negative income situation. The U.S. has a net trade deficit, which means, simply put, that the rest of the world makes more money off of us than we make off of it. It's pretty straightforward. These are the foreign cars we buy and the smartphones we buy that are assembled overseas. Again, let's start by looking at this rest of the world macro sector in isolation. You can see the rest of the world makes a lot of money off the U.S., and that loss is funded primarily by private sector borrowing or private sector debt. When we borrow money to buy that foreign car, it's the benefit to the rest of the world, it's an expense to us, and it results in increased debt in the private sector in the U.S. I'm not making a political or policy statement here. I'm just showing you the actual numbers. If we were to somehow reduce the trade deficit, this chart gets better. The rest of the world makes less off of us. To put it another way, the more we produce domestically, the higher the income of the business macro sector, and more of this income that is now going to the rest of the world is instead retained by U.S. businesses and households. Now, if we add the negative income of the four U.S. domestic macro sectors to the positive income of the rest of the world, it exactly equals zero. Voila! Income equals expense. So by definition, all the income and expense from these five macro sectors added together equals zero. So, with the data regularly supplied by the Federal Reserve, we can see clearly a number of truths about the U.S. economy. And again, this is one of the most useful ways to think about macroeconomics. One of the most important of these truths is the first one we examined today. The more the government spends, the more the U.S. private sector, its households and businesses, make. One factor that helps powerfully illustrate that is this. Since 1980, while the net worth of the government, with all its widely discussed debts, has gone from positive 32% of GDP to negative 34% of GDP, in that exact same time frame, the net worth of households has gone from 350% of GDP to 578% of GDP. People remind us regularly that the government's total debt is now $38 trillion, but the net worth of households is $180 trillion. The more the government spends, the more the U.S. private sector, its households and businesses make. Of course, most of that increase has gone to the wealthiest households, and therein lies the rub. We'll examine that in more detail on another day. So our recommendation to you as you begin looking at and thinking about the U.S. economy in these terms, which is something we regularly do here, and all of this data is readily available on our tycos.com website. Next week, we're going to dig a bit deeper into the profitability of businesses. That's it for this week. Thanks.